I can recount to you all the moment I decided I wanted to be an Olympian. It was the summer of 2012, and I was sitting in my nan's living room with my eyes glued to the TV screen, watching all the different sports play out during the London Summer Olympic Games. And something inside of me on that day just kind of clicked. See, I had been in track and field for about 7 months at this point, and I was loving absolutely every second of it. But on this day, I was watching our Canadian women's hammer throwers giving their all in the competition, masterfully executing every single movement, and they were so proudly sporting our country, which was emblazoned across their uniforms. And I made the decision right then and there that it did not matter what it took, that one day I would be right where they were, competing at the Olympic Games with the best in the world. And so from there, I began to construct my athletic foundation over the next 8 years. I was developing and becoming more powerful, stronger, faster of an athlete every single year. I had dedicated myself to my studies and even earned a full scholarship to the University of California, Berkeley. And by the time I was in my post-COVID senior year, I had had the honor of representing Canada on 4 national teams, earning my first NCAA national championship title, and even becoming a world junior champion. But at the beginning of the fall semester of 2020, I found myself sitting in my coach's office. We were a year out from the Tokyo Olympic Games, and he and I were planning out all of our training and competitions for the year, and I sort of worked up the courage to tell him the exact same thing I had been telling myself countless times over the course of those 8 years. Coach, I want to be an Olympian. I want to go to the Olympics. And he kind of sat back in his chair, and he gave me a small smile. And he said, okay, then let's turn that goal into a set of objectives. So at this point, you may be wondering, what is the difference between having a goal versus having an objective? Why is it so important to differentiate the two? And in answer, I want us all to run a very, very, very quick little thought experiment. And I want you all to take a second and think about a goal that you want to achieve. Close your eyes if you need to. Take those couple of seconds. It can be as big or as small as you would like, as long as you know that it is something that you want to do, that you can see yourself at a place that you want to get to. So think, ponder, take this couple seconds, and 3, 2, 1, bring it back. So that goal is now your finish line. But we must now ask ourselves, how will we get there? And this is where the importance of having objectives comes into play. Because with all due respect to what we can or cannot control in our lives, this is what keeps people dreamers instead of doers, not knowing how to plan out to best achieve success in their goals. Having a set list of objectives allows us to navigate our journey towards success. It gives us a step-by-step, play-by-play of how exactly we want to execute every single decision that we make so that we can maximize our utmost potential and create the best end experience for ourselves. And so with that, my coach and I planned out 3 objectives that we wanted to achieve in order to get to the Olympic Games. And so now, I'll preface that by saying I understand not all 3 of these objectives may apply to your lives and your goals, and that's okay. If it's all 3, then that's fantastic. And if it's 1, that's okay as well. What I want to exemplify through my experience is that it is the importance of planning out every single decision that we make, that can lead to the most success in our lives. And so with that, I will go to objective number 1. Hit the qualifying standard. So this may sound a bit obvious at first, because how do you get to the Olympic Games without hitting the qualifying standard? But it's important to know that there are actually 2 ways that you can qualify to go to the Olympics. The first is by hitting the automatic qualifying standard, which for throwing events like mine, like hammer throw, or for jumping events is measured in distance. But for running events, it's measured in time. And so the qualifying standard for women's hammer throw for the Olympic Games that year was going to be 72.50 meters. 72 meters. And so when we were looking at this objective, when we saw that this is where we needed to be, we started to plan towards that immediately. Because what is the other way that you can qualify to go? Well, it's by this thing called a point system, where essentially every competition that you enter into earns you more and more points. And the higher level of a competition that you do, the more points you get. And once you're in the top 32 athletes in the world, you could potentially get a bid by your national team to maybe represent your national federation at the Olympic Games, hopefully. And so with those keywords, I think you can see where I'm going with this. We knew hitting the qualifying standard would be the best way to execute our plan. First and foremost, because it's a lot more sure of a decision. It's way harder to dispute your position and your place on a national team if you've proven that you can hit the standard and you can go. But there is another key reason why hitting the qualifying standard was so important as opposed to doing it by a points-based system. When you rely on points, you are setting yourself up to potentially overcompete during the year. And overcompeting can lead to an increase in potential injuries as well as burnout. So now we were trying to mitigate risk because during an Olympic year, you do not have the time and you do not have the leeway to go through any of those hard experiences. You have to be so methodical. And the earlier that you hit the qualifying standard, the better, because then you get to move on to objective number 2, which is making it a habit. So it might sound like a leap at first to think of doing something once to then trying to do it every single time you compete. But it is important to note that instead of thinking of it as I did it once, now I need to do it again, we can think of it as I did it once, so now I know I can do it again. And consistency is so key. We can think of this in a school setting as when we do our homework, the better we do on our homework assignments, the more prepared we are for quizzes, right? And the better we do on our quizzes, the more prepared we are for midterms. And so now, when we look at the end goal, we can see that putting all 3 of these things together, homework and quizzes and a midterm, preparing for all of those sets us in the best position possible to execute on our final exams. Because you can't rely on luck. And when my coach was telling me about the Olympics, telling me what we would have to do once we got there, I realized that very quickly. Consistency is key because you cannot rely on luck. On the day, I had no clue what the other competitors were capable of, how they were thinking, how they were feeling, what they would do. But what I did know on that day was what I could do. And that truly, in that moment, is all that matters. So, we've gone now from objective number 1, doing it once, to objective number 2, making it a habit. And this now leads us to objective number 3, which is performing when it counts. The biggest competition I had leading up to the Olympics was going to be the NCAA National Championships, 2 months before the Olympic Games were set to take place and before I was set to compete. And I previously mentioned that I had won this competition 2 years prior before COVID. And that immediately upped the stakes. Because now, I was going into this competition not just trying to win a back-to-back national championship, but I was now having to prove myself. I needed to prove that I could get to the big stage and execute perfectly. That when I got to Tokyo, I could be a force to be reckoned with. And so going into this competition, my coach and I were on a mission. We prepared, we planned, I was excited, I was so nervous, but we got there and we executed on the big stage. And with a new personal best and NCAA record, I walked away from this competition feeling so excited, so happy that, oh my gosh, like I did it, I proved myself, I was able to do it when it counts most, when it matters. But I realized I had learned another skill that was equally as, if not even more important, and that was confidence. Now I knew that I could do it on the big stage. I even told that to my coach. I said, oh my gosh, coach, like I did it, like we did it, we planned perfectly, we got all the details down to a T, we set our objectives right, we got everything done, and I could do it. And he gave me this sort of look, he kind of rolled his eyes, just a little bit, and he said, Camryn, I knew you could do it already, but you had to do it yourself in order to believe that you could as well. And so with that, we had accomplished our 3 objectives moving into the Olympics. That was until I realized there was a 4th objective, and it snuck up on me because I didn't plan for it. 2 weeks before we were set to depart for Japan, I was starting to feel very excited, like extremely excited, like more excited than I'd ever been in my entire life. And this feeling soon turned into nervousness, which, is fair. It's really hard to prepare for the Olympics until you've been to the Olympics. But it started to nag, and it lingered, and it wouldn't kind of go away. It stayed with me through training sessions, it stayed in the back of my mind at all times, and it wasn't until we were literally about to leave for Japan that I realized that what I was feeling was fear. Fear of failure. Fear of not performing. Fear that I was unworthy to compete with the best in the world. And so with this, I realized that there was a 4th objective. Believe that you belong there. I had unknowingly found myself in a bout of imposter syndrome. And this feeling was terrifying because it was like we had done all the planning, all the work to make this happen, to make this a reality. We were literally at our training camp in Gifu, which is a small town about 6 hours south of Tokyo. We were a week out from the Olympics. And it wasn't until 3 days from my qualifying event that this took a sudden change. Because 3 days before the event, I found myself in the Olympic Village, in the dining hall, at lunchtime, grabbing a tray of food and going to find my friends so we could eat and so I could calm down a little bit. And I took a second once we got in there, and I just kind of stood and observed. And I realized, like truly realized in that moment, I was surrounded by the best in the world. There were national record holders, national champions, world champions, Olympic world record holders. They were all there. And then I began to spot my competition. I looked to my left, there were the Americans. I looked to my right, the Polish. There was the Italian. There was the Romanian. They were everywhere. But I stood back for another second and had a sort of moment of realization. And in this realization, I found I could humanize everybody. Because here we were, eating lunch, 3 days before we were set to compete in the Olympics, I was the second youngest person there. And I realized that all of those individuals, every single person who I was seeing in that room, had been in the exact same position that I had been at some point in their lives. Some of those people were having that exact moment right then and there. And when I started looking at the other hammer throwers, I realized that we were all passionate people, driven to success and driven to greatness on the exact same mission. If they could do it, so could I. This is what I had worked the last 8 years of my life to achieve. And so with that, this was the moment that I realized I belonged here. I had a place amongst the best in the world. I had mitigated the risks. I had built confidence in myself. I had become consistent. I was ready. And 3 days later, I was in the qualification at the Olympic Games. And I qualified through. 2 days after that, I was in the Olympic final. The last thing my coach said to me before I went out was, just go throw. You know what to do. You've planned for it. You've executed. Everything's down to a T. Just go out there and throw. And I finished 5th in my first Olympic Games. Thank you. 5th in the Olympic Games, the first Canadian woman ever to become a finalist in the women's hammer throw, the youngest ever finalist at the Olympics in that event. And so looking back on the journey that we took to get there, I realize having a set list of objectives helps guide us toward that ultimate final goal that we have. Because without those set objectives, we are left without sort of a way to navigate that process. We need that step-by-step play. It is so important. And you can apply this, whether it is preparing for the Olympic Games or even just studying for a test. The applicability of this methodology can be used in day-to-day lives, which is what makes it so important. It's what can give us the edge over our competition and what can drive us forward to achieve the most success. And so when you reflect on that big goal that I asked you to pinpoint earlier on, I want you to be able to discern every single step that you took and that you can take in order to get there. I want you to find a path that is truly your own and know that whatever may lie at the end of it, that you are worthy of everything and every part of it. And most importantly, I want you to be brave enough to make that first decision that could potentially change the trajectory of your entire life, as it did for mine 10 years ago when I said, I want to be an Olympian. Thank you.